All right, well, welcome again. For those of you who have just joined us, this is the Biology Education Research Symposium. We're so glad to have you here. My name is Sue-Ann Young. I am a professor at SUNY Geneseo. Bill, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Sue-Ann. I'm Bill Hayborn, and I'm a faculty member in biology at Southern Utah University. As we get started today, we just want to give a shout out to two groups of people here. First of all, clearly our presenters were so excited about this great range of presenters, and Sue-Ann will tell us more about them here in just a moment. But we also want to take the opportunity just to thank our proposal reviewers. We couldn't make this work without them and all of their help. So a great shout out to that group of volunteers.
All right, thanks, Bill. So we'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. So we would like to acknowledge that our online symposium is taking place in locations throughout the US, on the traditional homelands of nearly 600 tribal nations. As we begin our symposium, we acknowledge and honor the original inhabitants of all of our regions and the enduring relationship between Indigenous peoples and their traditional homelands. As educators who seek to teach all students, we can take on the responsibility to learn and teach about the relevance of recognizing and respecting the traditional stewards of the land. Acknowledging land is an important step to cultivating meaningful partnerships with Native communities for the stewardship of their cultural resources and their homelands, and is a step on the long and for many overdue journey toward equity. As educators and researchers, we can work toward this equity in our classrooms and our other spaces, from teaching aspiring healthcare workers about the disproportionate toll of COVID-19 on Native communities, to helping our students affirm and value Indigenous knowledge, to being role models on how to accept the truth of counter-narratives. So please take this moment with us to honor the resilience of the Indigenous people of our respective locations and show our support for their strength. And so we want to express particular gratitude to the Piscataway people, especially the Cedarville Band of the Piscataway-Conoway, the Piscataway Indian Nation, and the Piscataway-Conoway tribe, who are the traditional stewards of the land on which Baltimore, Maryland resides, the planned location for this year's NABT conference. We also want to acknowledge that Geneseo, New York, from which I'm speaking to you, from SUNY Geneseo, is located on the traditional lands of the Seneca Nation of Indians and the Tonawanda Seneca Nation, and that Cedar City, Utah, where Bill Hayborn is, SUU, is on the traditional lands of the Paiute, which is also the crossroad for Indigenous peoples, including Utah's 8 tribal nations. So as Bill mentioned, this symposium could not be possible without our generous reviewers. This symposium is a result of double-blind peer review. If you are interested in helping us review, we will put a link to the Google form in the chat where you can put your information about your availability and your areas of expertise, and we thank you for that.
I just put that link in the chat.
Fantastic, thank you. So our presentations today address topics from the K-12 to university education levels, and are from case studies to national in scope. Our format for our symposium is 15-minute presentations with 5 minutes of Q&A. And we'd like you to submit your questions to the presenters using this Q&A function. If a question has already been posted that you are interested in having the answer to, that you have the same question for, you are able to, as an attendee, upvote those questions. The chat, Janet, you can correct me if I did this wrong, the chat is enabled so that you can communicate to us, the panelists, directly. So if there's anything that you want to tell us through the chat, you can do that as well. There is closed captioning that's also available. At the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should see a little button that says, actually, I don't know what it says because I'm screen sharing. Does it say closed captions or CC? At least says CC. So you can click on that to access the closed captioning. We also want to note that all of the symposium talk proposals are published on the NABT website in the symposium proceedings. Bill, could you post a link to that in the chat as well?
I
So we
will.
ask that you cite the authors when sharing their work, especially if you're using social media. You can feel free to use hashtag NABT 2020 as well. But know that there is a citation available through the proceedings. So we have 4 great talks for you. And then followed by those talks is a 30-minute keynote by Amanda Glaze-Krampus, the 2020 NABT 4-year college section research award winner. And then there's time for questions once more after that. Right, Bill, how do I do? Did I leave anything out?
Sue-Ann, I think you did a great job. I think we might be ready a minute or two early.
All right. So we gave ourselves plenty of time for buffer just in case. So I think we can go ahead and start getting set up here. I'd like to introduce Cole. Cole, would you like to share your screen? I'm going to stop sharing mine so you can start sharing yours. So Cole Entrest comes to us from the Teachers College, Columbia University, and he's going to tell us about living organisms and the life science class.
Okay, should I start?
I think you can get started.
Okay, great. Hi everybody. My name's Cole. It's such a gas to be here on this this virtual convention. I love going to NABT in person, but I really love not paying for hotel rooms. So I'm psyched to be here talking to you guys through the ether. I am going to talk to you today a little bit about our biology classes and our biology teachers, or one of them anyway, because this is a case study. You know, biology, I'm sure this is no surprise to most of the folks out there, that's the last required science course that most people ever have to take. And so it's my opinion, and I imagine maybe yours as well, that we should really try to make it count. And part of me thinks this shouldn't be so hard because it is so cool to learn about the living world all around us. E.O. Wilson has called this biophilia, the innate connection we feel to other living things. And from crusty adults like me to cute little kids, this is my son, Halden. We got him an ant farm when he was 2. This is like a year ago. And he couldn't get enough of it because interacting with other living things sparks something within us. The sad truth, though, is that Halden here spent more time interacting with his ants the first day that we got them than a lot of kids spend with living things in a year's worth of a typical biology class here in New York City, where we live. Instead, most people experience biology as a endless procession of worksheets that look something like this. This is, I think, a problem for the obvious reason that it strips from biology everything that might be interesting to people who weren't already enthusiastic about memorizing the steps of biochemical pathways, which is to say everybody. But it's also in pretty direct conflict with a lot of our current thinking about how we should be reforming biology teaching so that it reaches more students and gives us a greater understanding of our biome in this country and worldwide. So, you know, the national academies who produced the framework for K-12 science education, which led to the NGSS, have said this, that, well, let me just give you a second to read it. You don't have to listen to me read what's on the page. So the idea here is that investigation needs to be central to how we are learning about biology. And I imagine here at NABT, where presentations, even in a virtual format, involve CRISPR kits and having kids dose themselves with sucralose, this is probably seen as a cool, bracing challenge, a way to be our most authentic selves as teachers. But it's also, for a lot of biology teachers, a scary call to action. Because especially in freshman level biology, we're studying everything from nanosecond long enzyme action to millennia spanning climate events that change across the entire world biome. And so these things are hard to turn into authentic investigations as a centerpiece of instruction. It's even hard to make investigations for things that happen in what Wilson again calls organismal time, because it is complicated to maintain, use, husband living organisms, the central unit of biological investigation, inside the classroom. And this isn't just me hypothesizing. The National Academies has also said that in order to reach the vision of the next generation science standards, teachers are going to have to learn a lot more. And I think a lot of that learning, some of that learning anyway, is going to have to be about how do we do investigations, humanely, effectively, in an exciting way, using living organisms in biology class. Because the truth is there's just not a lot of it going on right now. I am not the first person to notice this, but the question, of course, is why. Let's talk about a few of the reasons that have traditionally been given for the exclusion of living things from biology classrooms. So I'll start over here with the Benjamins, because obviously it is not a zero resource proposition to keep stocks of living things on the ready for classrooms, nor is it a zero time proposition, right? It takes both money and time. Interestingly, I read some research that suggested that once upon a time in the UK, at least, schools routinely employed technicians to keep all the lab materials sort of ready for the biology courses and the chemistry courses in their secondary schools. Now, I taught for 5 years in American schools in the 2000s, did not find that to be the case. I saw maybe one technician who ran the copy room at the high school I taught in Chicago. But anyway, the point is that it takes resources to do this, and we don't always have them. Next, moving over to the upper right here, there are liability and litigation concerns, right? Nobody wants to be responsible for a lawsuit that comes if a kid cuts their hand on a flask and gets a nasty E. coli infection. But it's also hard to have living organisms in your classroom because there are pressures from curricula, from the AP to freshman level curricula for the regents in New York, that push you to cover a lot of content in a limited amount of time. We've also had the influences of sort of animal rights groups, which I think actually have had a salutary influence in many ways in terms of minimizing the number of organisms we use non-judiciously, as well as the development of an ever better set of sort of electronic and digital alternatives to hands-on investigations. I don't think that these alternatives capture all the qualities of experience you get from doing a real hands-on lab, but I certainly understand their cost effectiveness, time effectiveness, and the fact that you can do repeated trials. All this to say, lots of advantages to these kinds of technologies. But the thing that I want to talk about today, and which I think has not received much attention, is the way that teacher education has sort of stopped teaching would-be biology teachers about field work or natural history or lab technique using living things, all of which might prepare teachers to do a better job with this in their classrooms. So this wasn't always the case. This is kind of a whole separate paper, but a couple of quick snapshots. Here's a course catalog from 1926 at Teachers College, and you can see that the sort of methods course for biology teachers included substantial attention to laboratory practices, field work, and the collection and preservation of specimens. And it wasn't just in course catalogs, we also see it in textbooks. This is a book from 1940 that included all kinds of advice for teachers, including how to keep alligators in your class. This tickles me because it's not the only reference to keeping alligators that I found from this time period. And like, what do you do with an alligator when it's time for summer vacation and the thing has gotten 300 pounds big? I'm sure we can all think of at least one student we might have volunteered for alligator feeding duty in our teaching careers. So, the point is that this stuff used to be part of our teacher education curriculum, and now it's not. And I think a lot of teachers go to the field unprepared to encounter curriculum materials like this. This is from the BSCS Blue Book. It is a suggested lab for Chapter 10. I remember seeing this as a biology teacher and thinking, oh no. Well, I mean, you can see what my reaction was right there on the screen. But I thought, among other things, who has time to learn how to care for a polychaete worm, order it, put it in an ice chest, like for just one of many labs in a unit? I think the only people who might have that kind of time are people like the subject of this case study, people whose apartments are already overrun by assorted plants and animals. Now you might see some test tubes down here in the corner. Those contained tadpoles at different stages of development. And this apartment, this is just a look into a Brooklyn apartment, also contained habitats for ants, roaches, superworms, Drosophila dart frogs, chameleons, a puppy, and it might surprise you to learn, a live human woman there of her own volition. This guy, Mike Dulap, we're going to call him because we're scrupulous researchers who use pseudonyms, was also a local living environment teacher. That's what we call biology in New York State. And he was finishing up his MAT in science education. And so I made a case study of him in the spring of 2019. trying to get a sense of how do, despite the obstacles to doing it, some biology teachers develop the will and the skill to make judicious use of living organisms in their classrooms, or translated into researcherese, I posed these 3 questions to investigate via the case study. In short, I wanted to find out how he learned so much about live organisms, how it impacted his identity as a science teacher, or what that knowledge did to him, and how he was able to use that knowledge in his classroom. Now, I've already previewed for you a lot of the literature relevant to living organisms, but so I've created a sort of quick diagram for you to take in the landscape of other literature that might be relevant here. Give you a second to just take it in. You might want to take notes. So this is to say, not a lot of research in this area. There is a burgeoning literature on science teacher identity, but a lot of it relates to college science professors who are balancing their researcher and teacher identities, and elementary science teachers who kind of have a phobia about science, and they have to come to terms with the fact that they are also going to teach it. The knowledge of organisms literature is mostly about the obstacles teachers face to having them in their own classroom, but there's also some interesting work done on the benefits for students of keeping mice or studying live organisms in class. But we're really on a place here where what's needed is exploratory research, which is why I selected a case methodology. Also, I didn't have a lot of time, candidly. So there is, however, one thing from theory that I think is interesting. When we look at the literature on situated learning or situated cognition, it gives us a hypothesis about where teachers who've nonetheless developed a real focus for working with live organisms might get that knowledge or that identity from. And so the folks in situated learning say that learning is not just something that happens in classes, but it happens through the activities that we engage in with the communities we choose to be a part of all the time and every day. And so, in short, we should be looking outside of formal educational structures to see how teachers who are learning unusual things are doing it. So a couple of quick notes about methodology. I will be brief here, but you can feel free to put some venomously specific questions into the Q&A, so you can nail me on all the flaws in the case design here. I chose a teacher with extensive knowledge in living organisms and who is currently doing teacher education to make it a little bit easier to compare the kind of learning that was taking place with what was happening in the classroom. This is called a rare case, and I chose 1 semester as a sort of time boundaries on the case, mostly for convenience purposes. Data collection was Catholic in its approach. I had a questionnaire, I had 2 interviews, I had 5 observations with debriefs, and I checked in all the time with Mr. Dulap and occasionally students about what was going on in the class. Everything was analyzed in vivo, coded according to research questions inductively, and then sort of collapsed into 3 assertions or themes, all very standard stuff for case methodology, and then some standard credibility measures as well. So what did we find? There were essentially 3 things. The first thing was, as we might have expected, the way that Mr. Dulap learned about living things was not through his formal education, either as a biology major, undergraduate, or as in a science education program, master's program. Instead, it came from all the hours that he spent tending saltwater aquariums, working in exotic pet stores, keeping lizards, snakes, fish, and all the other stuff that I had mentioned earlier in his home and in his classroom with students. And so then the second thing, so in short, his knowledge was situated in his hobbyism, which was essentially a lifelong hobbyism, starting from the time when he was maybe in middle school. The second finding, which I did not expect and was interesting, was that it wasn't just that live organism study was an important part of how Mr. Dulap thought about teaching. It was also an important part of his journey into becoming a science learner. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. And then last, and this one I think was more expected, that the knowledge that he gained about using and keeping living things was better attuned to hobbyism than to teaching exactly. So there were imperfect matches between what he knew and was able to do and what might be optimal for using organisms to teach biology. Should provide a little bit of evidence in my remaining time. One thing is, here's the quote that, this was in our first long interview. I asked Mike how much of his knowledge had come from college courses and teacher education courses, and he was pretty blunt about that. And I was like, great, case study over. But we continued to talk nonetheless. He said all of his knowledge came from having a fish tank, getting interested in aquarium keeping in high school, and built from there. Then to talk a little bit more about his teacher identity and his student identity, he talked about the sort of lucky correspondence between what he was learning about his fish tank and the different topics they were doing in his chemistry class, ironically, not his biology class. pH, chemistry, polar and nonpolar bonds, all this stuff was related to him trying to maintain the water and keep the fish alive in his aquarium. And he said, I realized too that, quote, oh, what I've actually been doing all along is science. And in fact, as he got more and more into the sort of like world of exotic pets, he found himself teaching people on online forums. And that was actually one of his first introductions to science teaching. So that was another, I thought, interesting finding. The last thing was just, the things that he asked for in terms of like what were obstacles to him were the same things that research has shown again and again. He didn't have a sink in his room. He doesn't have the space or the time to build 100 fruit fly cultures for kids to experiment on. And he expressed some interest in learning more about how these sorts of investigations might work in classrooms as opposed to in the sort of hobbyist situation. So what have we maybe learned, right? One is that there are tons of interesting resources out there for this kind of work, but they just aren't in teacher education yet. When teachers develop an identity that it's important to them to have life in the room with them as they're teaching about life, they can overcome some of the structural obstacles that are there. And I think that I'll just finish by saying we should think about how we can nurture those kinds of identities as we're doing pre-service biology teacher education and in-service professional development. Okay, great. That's what I've got. I would love to take some questions, I guess. And Susan, you let me know if this is right or wrong. I should just try to read ones off the Q&A and address those. Yes?
Correct. Yes. So we have a couple of questions that have popped into the Q&A.
Okay, I'm going to
in one question. And as others think of questions, feel free to put them into the Q&A. So if you aren't familiar with this functionality, there is a little button at the bottom of your Zoom screen that says Q&A. So click on that and you'll see the questions that have been submitted.
Great. Yeah, I see two both from Todd's. That's fun. I wonder what the proportion of Todd's is in this conference versus the general population. Todd Nims has a tip about if your state has alligator farms, you can work out a deal with them to supply you with a baby alligator, and then you take it back to them, like a car trade-in, when it gets too big and you get a new one. Great tip, Todd. Nobody wants a 400-pound alligator in their house. Thanks for that. And Todd Kelson asks, did Mr. Dulap tie all his animal examples with specific NGSS standards, or did he just use them as supplements to classroom teaching? Great question. And this is related to the third finding, deeper in the details, which you might see in the proceedings. The answer is there was a little bit of both. There was, for instance, a really interesting time when he brought his kids down to the Hudson River, close to the school. They collected a bunch of water and did some plankton screens, brought the plankton back to the class. That was well integrated into the second disciplinary core idea of the NGSS in biology. And so they learned a lot about ecosystems and stuff there. But other times it was just like, there were kids who would come in and they would be interested in learning more about the chameleon he kept because it was awesome. And occasionally they would reference it during class. I heard them one time talk about, they were talking about parthenogenesis, and they asked, because the chameleon, like a chicken, would lay unfertilized eggs. It was a female. And so he asked the class, well, is this an example of this? Why or why not? So there were moments like that. But I would say in general, partially because of the constraints of what we're doing in schools, 45-minute periods, you got to cover this, that, and the other. I would not say that live organisms were frequently the center of sustained investigations in the way we might like. Great question. Thank you, Todd. This one from Julie. Describe what a college science methods class would look like to incorporate your ideas into the curriculum for pre-service science teachers. Yeah, great. I would, I think that there is some low-hanging fruit for us to teach teachers about. There are some systems like the Wisconsin fast plants, or like the halobacterium that the lady at the University of Maryland, her name is Desarma, has developed in ways that are pretty teacher-friendly and designed for educational contexts, and including some like a sort of laboratory section where teachers got to use those organisms, design units about them, talk about best practices, would be great. I've been chatting a little bit with Hetty Loffer at the Wisconsin Fast Plants organization about trying to figure out if we could organize a way for teachers in their field experience for us to support their cooperating teachers with giving them some stuff, right? Some grow lamps, some other fast plants associated things, and having them redo one of their units on, I don't know, genetics or germination or photosynthesis, and allowing the new teachers and the more experienced teachers both to be learning about that with some support, reflecting on some of the promise and the difficulty of teaching using live organisms. That's at best, I'm sorry, Julie, a spotty answer, but I think it maybe suggests some of the directions we might go, short of me, sending you a syllabus that doesn't exist yet. Also, a great question. Gee, thanks. Oh, I see one more. Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.
Are there other questions for Cole?
Cole, I have a question. So I appreciate Julie's question about how we might incorporate this into a methods course.
Yeah.
What about people who are already practicing teachers and don't have a lot of experience keeping live things? How do they get their hands dirty, literally, if they're noobs to this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good question too. In education research, we focus so much on pre-service teachers when they actually make up a sort of pretty small piece of the pie of the total folks who are out there teaching. So the professional development question is very much a germane one. I think that there are some things that individual teachers can do already. Get involved with botanic gardens or museums or other institutions of informal learning nearby, as well as with universities that are proximate. Because one, a lot of universities have outreach budgets and people that go a little bit underutilized. And two, these informal institutions love to partner with schools. So on an individual basis, I think it's sort of about identifying the opportunities that are in your area and getting started with them. But I think ultimately we need some more programmatic options for people. I mean, the American Modeling Teachers Association had grant money for a while to bring teachers in for a big institute in the summer. And this was all in-service teachers who wanted to learn about modeling pedagogy. And this was a great program. The problem is, like, when the NSF money ran out, they couldn't pay people to do it anymore. They couldn't fly people in. So a site-based alternative is one way, or a site-based program is one way you might think of it. But I actually wonder about sort of informal networks of people, using some of the same sources that Mr. Dulap ran into in his learning, like YouTube streamers, sort of Twitter communities. There are already a lot of big, like, science education Twitter communities, and just sort of like enabling sort of more like localized and grassroots ways of people finding those opportunities until we can figure out some sort of good national professional development model. Because it's a big question. I don't know. Oh, we got a bunch more in the Q&A now, real quick. I don't want to run over anybody else's time. Should we? But I'm happy to continue to talk about these. Susan, sorry, Sue-Ann, you cut me off when it's time. Okay.
All right, keep going.
All right, I'm going to hold you to it. Lena, totally agree. Pets in the classroom. Oh, they're a group. I thought you were talking about the idea. Is a great group that provides small grants to get people started with a pet and a setup. Yeah, I think that's right. And even though like a class pet is not like pedagogically turbocharged, it can really make a difference. I had turtles when I taught in New Jersey. Don't tell anyone because they were illegal. But kids were so into them. They would come in and visit the turtles on in between classes, and I'd be like, I'm here too, and I'm a person. There's no question. I'm sentient and have feelings. Is very interesting, right? Like, sort of pet keeping is really entrancing to some kids, even kids who don't necessarily have developed academic science identities already. So yeah, absolutely, great tip. Donald asks, are pre-service teachers assist in teaching our intro labs that use live organisms? How practical would that be at other universities, e.g. yours? Well, great question. I mean, I think that's probably a good model to give teachers a little bit of practice with the kind of lab techniques that they need. I don't know exactly what they do in the other part of Columbia. Teachers College is sort of like cordoned off by itself. and we only have graduate programs. So I don't know. That's a good, but it's, look, we're in a disruptive time right now. It's very hard to place student teachers. So this might be actually like a really good thought moving forward. Thanks, Donald. Carrie says, how can those of us who create or run informal biology programs support teachers? I would say you guys are already experts in so many things that a lot of teachers would love to learn more about. I think it's just about finding ways to connect with them and ask, how do we make this work? Teachers are so busy, and they would love to hear, this is me sort of speaking for a big group, so take this with a grain of salt, but they would love to hear about people who's like, I know how to do X. You guys have a unit related to X coming up, maybe we can collaborate. I think if you can sort of, nail them down in terms of getting that time to call you back, most teachers would love to have somebody else help with some of the logistical difficulty and sort of theoretical front loading that comes with doing new kinds of lab experiences. That's my guess. Thank you. And oh yeah, and Jill talks about hissing cockroaches. Love hissing cockroaches. And in fact, there's a guy who's always making the circuit here at NABT called Ron Wagler, who has a lot of interesting ideas about using arthropods as teaching organisms. And the Madagascan hissing cockroaches is one of the ones that he big ups. He, in fact, I think he just had an article in the American Biology Teacher about pill bugs, or isopods anyway, which are another. They don't bite, they don't fly, they can't escape very easily. Lots of advantages to somebody who is new at organism keeping. Yeah, so some great tips, some wonderful questions. Thank you guys so much. Right. Oh, I feel so productive watching these questions disappear. It's like getting rid of emails.
You have accomplished something in this COVID-19 stress time. It's nice to be able to check those off, right?
Here's my margarita.
Thank you, Cole. So I don't know, Janet, are people able to put in their emotions or something like that, or say thank you? I actually don't know how clapping works in a webinar, but I'm sure everyone is clapping for you there, Cole. Thank you. All right, so next up we have Kate Parsley. Kate, would you like to go ahead and set up your screen share?
Yep. Okay, everybody can see it?
I do. Okay, so Kate and her colleagues Bernie Daigle and Jamie Sable are going to tell us about their work on an initial development and validation of the Plant Awareness Disparity Index. Take it away, Kate.
So I'm going to talk to you guys about a survey that I've created. If I can get my computer to work, there we go. Plant awareness disparity is the idea that people don't notice plants in their environment. And this used to be called plant blindness. So if that term is more familiar to you, that's probably why. It was originally coined by Wandersee and Schuessler in 1999. I recently published a paper arguing that we should change the term. So shameless self-promo, please do go look at that paper. I hope that everybody likes it. But it is comprised of 4 different components. The first is attention, which is just strictly the idea that people don't notice plants, and that is the most popular version of plant awareness disparity. The second is attitude, which is students tend not to like plants or enjoy learning about plants. And if anybody teaches a general biology class and you hear students like, oh, plants are so boring, that's what that is. Knowledge is students needing to understand the importance of plants, not just to humans, but to the biosphere in general. And then relative interest is just the idea that students tend to find plants less interesting than other organisms, usually animals. So PAD or PAD can lead to a lot of naive and anthropocentric points of view about plants, like they don't matter, humans don't need them. It can also lead to a lot of misconceptions about plants, like plants don't evolve, plants aren't alive. My personal favorite is plants don't quote unquote do anything, which is hilarious. Many interventions have been suggested to address PAD, but it's hard to tell if these interventions are actually addressing PAD or if they're addressing maybe like a particular component of PAD or something that is related to PAD. And we don't know that for sure unless we can measure PAD before and after the intervention. So we created what's called the Plant Awareness Disparity Index, or the PAD-I. The original version, once we were all done developing it, was 8 items for attitude, 8 for knowledge, 6 for relative interest, and 6 for attention, for a total of 28 items. We did develop the instrument with all 4 of components of PAD in mind, thinking that they would be 4 factors in factor analysis. It has a Likert style scale consisting of completely disagree, somewhat agree, and completely agree as your answer options. Note that we did not include a neutral. People often ask me why this is, and it's because when students don't care about plants and you give them a survey that is about nothing but plants, they tend to pick neutral a lot, which means that you don't get any results from it, which is not good. So we coded these answers from 1 to 4. 1 is always the least aware of plants answer, and the 4 is always the most aware of plants. So if I have an item that says, I notice the plants that are grown near where I live, and then a student indicates they completely agree with that, they'd get a 4. And if they indicate they completely disagree with that, they get a 1. There were both positive and negative items present. So what I just told you was an example of a positive item, but a negative item would be like, I think plants are unimportant to humans. And obviously if a student answered completely agree to that, we don't want to give them a 4, we give them a 1. And if they disagree, we give them a 4. So essentially what this means is that the higher score on the instrument is a more qualitatively positive outcome. They actually have less PAD. They're more aware of plants. And we did this because it's kind of like a higher score on an exam is a positive outcome. They have more knowledge. So the minimum score was 28 if they answered all the items with a negative or plant unaware answer. The max was 112 if they answered everything with a positive or plant aware answer. And for expert review on this, during the process of development, we used Dr. Elizabeth Schussler. She's been incredibly helpful in editing and giving us suggestions for the instrument. So the first thing we did was use the PAD-I in a pilot study to get some face validity and concept validity. This took place in a small university in Illinois in a botany class, which was required for biology majors and environmental science minors. This class included active learning, course discussions, book reflections, a semi-comprehensive final, and a lab component. There were 38 participants in the first semester and 40 in the second. We used the PAD-I as a pre-post test, and then we did 5 interviews in each semester with participants from a range of PAD-I scores. So we wanted to get a lot of different ideas about plants in there. For the analysis, we did a repeated measures ANOVA for the PAD-I and all 4 subscales within the PAD-I. And then in the interviews, we looked at students' answers about, does the instrument make sense? Do you understand what we're asking you? Are there any questions that don't make sense or don't apply to you? Does your score seem valuable and like correct and accurate? And then we also looked at their experiences with plants to see if this matched up with their PAD-I score. So if they got a really high score on the instrument, but they were talking about a whole lot of negative experiences with plants in the interview, that would have indicated that the instrument isn't measuring what we would like it to measure. So in the first semester, the PAD-I scores increased significantly from pre to post, as did the attention and knowledge subscores. So what this means is that students felt they noticed plants more, and they also felt they knew more about plants after the botany class was over. And you'll notice that the attitude and relative interest subscores did not increase significantly, which is important for a reason that I'll tell you in just a minute. In the second semester, the PAD-I scores increased significantly again, as did attention and perceived knowledge, and this time so did relative interest. So students noticed plants more, felt like they knew more about plants, and found plants slightly more interesting. But you'll note if you want to look at the effect size, that's the smallest effect size. So it is significant, but it is only significant for a small portion of that class, which is interesting. So the ANOVA indicated the survey does respond to changing levels of PAD. We would hope that after a botany class that PAD would change in students, and that is exactly the result that we got. Otherwise, we would have had some issues that we needed to address with the instrument. The interviews indicated there was one item that posed problems in the instrument, and that item was removed. The item was asking students, I would take more plant courses for my degree. But the problem with that item is that not every university has a selection of plant courses to choose from. A lot of them may only have one or may only have a few. And so we went ahead and removed that because we wanted to validate this in undergraduate biology students across the US. The data indicates that attitude and relative interest in general didn't change, especially not as much as attention and knowledge did. And this kind of gets into what I call the knowledge deficit model of PAD, which is the idea that if we just teach students more stuff about plants, they will have less PAD. And that might be true if you already have a student who's interested in plants, but it's not necessarily true if you already have a student who does not care at all about plants. So if we really want to target the entirety of PAD with our interventions, we need to make sure we're bringing in these interest and attitude components, making sure that we're engaging students in interesting information about plants and using some sort of intervention that will help improve their attitudes about plants, because otherwise the Improvement in their pad may not be long-term, or it may not actually be an overall improvement. It may just be that they know more now than they did before. So after some tweaks and removal of that one item and more expert review, we sent this version of the PAD-I to NARST and SABRE listservs. For those who don't know, NARST is the National Association of Research in Science Teaching, and SABRE is the Society for Advancement of Biology Education Research. Remembering those alone, I feel like, is an accomplishment, so I'm very proud of myself right now. I got over 1,200 responses, which really shocked me because I was worried that because the survey is specialized, that people wouldn't be as interested. But whenever I got that many responses, I figured, okay, well, this is definitely something that people want. So I went ahead with the analysis. We did exploratory factor analysis with maximum likelihood factor extraction and direct Obermann factor rotation. We did data cleaning with using base R because I do not know how to use tidyverse. I'm sorry, I don't mean to disappoint anybody, but that is just not how I do things. And then we used the site package for the actual analysis itself. So remember, we designed the instrument with these 4 components of PAD in mind: the attention, attitude, relative interest, and knowledge. And what we found was we got 6 factors back. And at first we were like, well, that doesn't make any sense because we put 4 factors in. But when we looked closely qualitatively at the items in these factors, we found that they aligned conceptually with the 4 components of PAD. So for example, in this factor, understanding the necessity or importance of plants, all the items were things about, like, I think plants are important to the environment, I think plants are important to the ecosystem, I think plants are important to humans, and that aligns really well with the knowledge component of PAD. Relative interest, this cracks me up every single time because we had 2 factors that are about relative interest. One side is plants are better than animals, and the other side is animals are better than plants. And I always envision this as like an argument going on between science teachers for some reason. And, you know, the animals better than plants people are probably wrong, but we're going to forgive them anyway because that's okay. So the attitude component looks like it broke into 2 factors: the positive effect factor and the caring for or investment in plants factor. Again, we saw these as conceptually very similar to each other and conceptually very similar to attitude, so we grouped them under that. And then the attention factor was really interesting because everything in the attention factor was about food. So noticing the crops that are grown where you live, or knowing what vegetables you're eating from the grocery store. And so we didn't want the instrument to be biased towards food plants only in this attention factor. So we made a new factor called general attention that included items for non-food plants so that hopefully we could get at that. And we figured if we did this again and we had a lot of problems with these particular items, that maybe people are just noticing plants if they're food plants, which is interesting in and of itself. But to balance out the instrument, we went ahead and made a new one and kept going. So again, tweaks and edits, added a few new items, sent it to Dr. Schuessler for more review. She gave us a lot of great feedback as per usual. And then we sent it back to the NARST and SABRE listservs again. And this time I got over 700 responses, which is still very impressive because this was when COVID hit and nobody, like everything was absolutely ridiculous. So I was very happy to get 700 responses in the middle of the COVID pandemic. We did the same methods again: exploratory factor analysis, maximum likelihood extraction, direct Obermann rotation, data cleaning with base R, and the psych package. The psych package is really easy to use for factor analysis. I highly recommend it. But this time we had a very similar result from last time, but we were having issues with the attention factor. Remember, I showed you we made a new attention factor and we had an attention to food plants factor. And so we tested 4 different models this time to see what would give us the best results. So the first one, we tried 7 factors, which would be the same 7 factors that you see here, and didn't remove any items. But we had a few items, especially in that attention factor, that were giving us kind of a hard time. They were cross-loading, they weren't loading very strongly. And so we tried removing those items, which gave us a slightly better result. And then we decided to try 6 factors and see maybe this extra factor over here isn't working out. So maybe we should just try 6 factors. And that gave us a pretty decent result. And then once we switched from 7 to 6 factors, we had a couple of items that were starting to be finicky, just like 13, 14, and 20. So we tried 6 factors again with the same 3 finicky items removed, plus 21 and 22, which were newly finicky for some reason. So the Tucker-Lewis index is a goodness of fit index. It tells you how well your model fits the data. And as you can see, the highest TLI score on here is the 4th model. And then the RMSEA is root mean square error of approximation, which is also a goodness to fit index, and you want that to be below 0.05, and all of these meet that criteria. And so we decided to go with model 4 because model 4 gave us a very well-rounded attention factor. Once we kicked out those items that were being particular and finicky and not wanting to load very strongly, we got an attention factor that was slightly shorter than the past versions. I think it's like 3 or 4 items, but it has items that include food plants and non-food plants, which means that it's more conceptually consistent, it's more well-rounded for the instrument itself, and it also is more stable it is a better fit according to the Tucker-Lewis index. Everything else pretty much stayed the same, which is why we were really excited, because that indicates that it has a relatively stable factor structure. So we still have the understanding the necessity and importance of plants for the knowledge component. We still have those 2 sides of the same coin for relative interest. We still have caring about plants and the positive affect toward plants for attitude. And now we have a nice, well-rounded attention factor that cooperates the way we want it to, includes food and non-food plants, and is conceptually consistent with those 4 components of PAD. So PAD-I has a stable factor structure and a Crumbbox alpha of 0.884. The 4 components of PAD are represented in the instrument by these 6 factors. The interesting thing to me is that this attitude and relative interest are the ones that broke into 2 subcategories in the factor analysis, and those are also the ones that did not increase significantly in the ANOVA results from the pilot study. And to me, that indicates that these are complex and multifaceted, and it may be why the knowledge deficit model isn't working for those, because you might have to have some combination of knowledge and experiences, or knowledge and an emotional attachment, to get at all 4 of those components of PAD. So I want to acknowledge my collaborators, Dr. Daigle, who taught me how to use R, which is not an easy feat. So you be very impressed by this man, because I am not good with computers. And then Dr. Sable, who is a fantastic advisor and has worked with me on all of this and has helped me maintain my sanity, because factor analysis is not an easy feat. Dr. Schuessler, who is our expert reviewer, has also been incredibly helpful, and I really appreciate her important feedback on all versions of this instrument. And then anybody, I don't know if anybody here saw this or passed it on to their students, but if you did, thank you so much. I would not have been able to get these kind of results without all of that data that I managed to get from you all and from your colleagues. My contact info is below. I am trying to validate this in middle school and high school students. So if you or someone you know teaches a middle school or high school biology class, please feel free to reach out, because I am trying to get this validated in more than one environment. But otherwise, I will take any questions that you guys have, if you have any.
Thank you, Kate. Looks like there are some questions in the Q&A, and I'm sure as people process your talk, they will add more questions here.
So Todd Kelson asks, were these surveys administered in botany classes only? And if not, did you take into account what course the survey was used in? We only allowed the survey to be used in biology classes. So we didn't restrict it to botany classes. We did restrict it to biology classes in general. It didn't have to be majors. It just had to be a college level biology class. And so that's why we wanted to get a wider variety of students, so that we would have hopefully a more stable instrument that wouldn't just be stable in the botany context, because it is useful in botany classes. You can use it in a botany class, but we wanted it to also be usable in biology classes in case general biology professors wanted to see this as well. Are you planning to run a confirmatory factor analysis? Yes and no. So the scores, from what I understand about confirmatory factor analysis, and Jill, I know you know a lot about this, so correct me if I'm wrong. I think the scores that we got on the last EFA were high enough to consider it as a confirmatory, because we got scores that were 0.7 and above. But if not, then I would probably need to look into how to run a confirmatory factor analysis, because I don't know what the difference is between EFA and CFA. Everything that I've seen in the literature is that the process is essentially the same, and we use the maximum likelihood extraction and direct Obermann rotation because those methods are also used in confirmatory factor analysis. Yes, we should. Okay, any other questions?
Kate, I was wondering if you have any thoughts about the different students who are in K-12 versus students who are in college on how they might, how your instrument may work differently for these different students.
Right. So for me, the first point of concern for me would be the reading level difference, because there may be some terms in the instrument as it is right now that students may not understand at the middle and high school level. I haven't taken to elementary yet because of that specific reason. I know elementary students will not understand some of these questions. So right now I'm still collecting data on like how these students are answering this at the middle and high school level. I think that I will probably have to make some changes to how I phrase some of the questions. But other than that, it just kind of depends on the data that I get back from this, first few rounds of sending it out to middle schoolers to see, what it is what they're understanding and how they're answering, and see if it's the same factor structure for them as it is for undergraduate biology students.
Thanks, Kate. Are there other questions or comments from attendees?
Is it all right if I ask a question?
Go for it.
First of all, Kate, thank you for doing this. I love me a good instrument. And I think lacking them is a big problem in a lot of sort of learning sciences research and education research. My question is about when you were choosing between those 4 different models, after your, I think, second or third round of testing.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know a lot about those goodness of fit scales, but the differences between the 4 models seemed very small to me.
Mm-hmm.
What are they big enough that, like, how big do they need to be before you really prefer one model over another?
So yeah, that's a good question. And I I tend to look at the Tucker-Lewis index the most because to me it makes the most sense, because the closer to 1 you get, the better fit you have. I think for me it's because we ran all those 4 models and they were so similar, it was really hard to decide on one. And that's why ultimately we looked at the TLI, we found the one with the highest TLI, and then we looked conceptually at what that meant for the instrument as a whole. And that to me felt like, based on us using it further in other research, even after that, it seemed to be a good call. But I would say if there's a 0.8 to a 0.9 difference in those things, I would say definitely, always pick the one that's going to be higher than that. This is the first instrument I've developed, so I don't have as much experience deciding between models, which is why I had to do a whole lot of reading and research to figure out which of those might be the best. And ultimately, especially because the differences were so small, it was really hard to make that choice. But yeah, I would say, like, if you have one model with like a 0.7 Tucker-Lewis index and you have another with a 0.8 and a 0.6, obviously I would always go with the one with the highest Tucker-Lewis index. And in this situation, it just so happened that, the Tucker-Lewis index wasn't super different between model to model, but the 4th model had the most conceptually consistent and, I guess, closest to our goal result that we wanted to get. So we went with that one. Does that answer your question? Cool. Okay.
Kate, I've got a question. I was wondering if you might speak a little more broadly to just the implications of plant awareness disparity. Like, what does this mean for kids at any grade level that they're not plant aware? What are the possible implications for them and their life, and for us as a society, and perhaps as biological educators?
So I tend to come at this from a science literacy perspective, because plants are a part of biology literacy and science literacy. So plant awareness disparity begins when you're a kid. A lot of times it's because K-12 science teachers may not like to teach about plants as much. They may not have the resources to teach about plants as much. It also starts with, like, you're teaching about evolution and you use nothing but animal examples, and then students suddenly think that plants don't evolve because you use nothing but animal examples, right? So it does start when you're a kid, and there's a lot of research that suggests that experiences outside the classroom also have a huge impact on PAD. So, if you grew up on a farm and your dad taught you how to garden, or your grandparents taught you how to take care of houseplants, like, those experiences have a big impact on how you approach plants later in life. But I'd say, at least in my research and the way that I approach PAD, the biggest problem with it to me is that the general public is then not plant literate, or not, plant aware enough to be scientifically literate. So if you take GMOs, for example, everybody like freaks out about GMOs, or thinks they're unhealthy, or thinks there's allergic reactions. There's all kinds of misconceptions about GMOs out there. And a lot of it is because people don't pay attention to plants in high school, and then don't take the time to educate themselves about this issue. And then they, read a very alarmist, article about it, and they freak out and decide that GMOs are horrible. And so it's one of those, like, it takes time to build literacy in anything. And when we don't have a consistent exposure of plants all the way from K-12 into college, you're not going to build that literacy about plants. And then you're going to get people who don't know where their food comes from, who don't know that, plants can help solve climate change. And, like, there's a lot of real world socioscientific examples that plants are actually a part of. Specifically, I feel like, from me, my biggest problem is that people are so disconnected from their food and from where their food comes from. And the pandemic has actually highlighted that, like, a lot of people are really becoming much more aware of their food and where it comes from, because they're trying to keep prices low, or because the pandemic has disrupted, entire swaths of our agricultural system. And so I feel like the food perspective is particularly important, because I've asked my students, like, okay, where does your food come from? And they say the grocery store. And I'm like, okay, but like, before that, where did it come from? So that can cause a lot of problems with food literacy, agricultural literacy, and just in general science literacy that has to do with plants later on, if we're not consistent with teaching plants throughout the K-12 and university experiences.
Thanks, Kate. Really interesting work.
Right, thank you, Kate. So everyone, I'm sure, is applauding in their unvideoed world here. Kate. And so I think we can now transition to our third speaker. So Liz Barnes is joining us from Middle Tennessee State, and with her colleagues Sarah Brownell and Kay Supriya of Arizona State are presenting. She's presenting on the religious backgrounds and evolution perceptions of Black and Hispanic students nationwide. Thanks, Liz. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here today virtually with me during such a challenging time. I wish I were here with you in person. My name is Elizabeth Barnes. I'm an assistant professor of biology education at Middle Tennessee State University. Today, as she said, I'm going to be talking about the relationships between religious backgrounds and evolution perceptions of students with different racial and ethnic identities. Specifically, I'm going to discuss how strong religious identities among Black and Hispanic students may influence their perceptions of evolution. So, oh, my slide advance is not working. Oh, there we go. Okay. So research shows that you're most likely to remember what's said at the beginning of my talk. So I want to start today with my main points. The study I'm about to show you will indicate that Black students in college biology classes have more unfavorable attitudes towards evolution than students from any other racial ethnic identity, and that these unfavorable attitudes towards evolution are statistically explained by stronger religious commitment among Black students, and that this pattern is unique among Black students. This is important to consider because although Black students are minoritized in every discipline of biology, they are almost completely absent from fields of biology that emphasize evolution the most, including evolutionary biology and ecology. So if we want to make evolution and biology a more inclusive place for Black students, then we may have to think about how we're addressing the relationship between evolution and religion and highlight compatibility with religion and evolution when we teach biology. However, I did not do this work alone, so I want to take some time to acknowledge my collaborators, Drs. Brownell, Sinatra, and Supriya, as well as my undergraduate, Tasia and Healy, who helped with this project. Further, identities of researchers can influence the interpretation of results. So I think it's important for me to recognize the diversity of identities involved in this project. This project focuses on racial and ethnic and religious identity, and among students in college classes, the researchers in this study identified as Black, South Asian, and white, as well as atheist, agnostic, and Christian. But it's important to note that the lead researchers on this study, Sarah Brownell, identify as white and secular. So we don't possess the identities that we're studying, which may be a limitation of the study. However, I do want to give a really big thanks to Supriya, who joined us as a postdoc and to our development as race ethnicity scholars. Okay, so this graph shows data from the US Census and the National Center for Education Statistics. The black dotted lines are the percent of the United States population that is Black, Asian, and Hispanic. The bars are the percent of PhDs awarded to these groups within different fields of biology, including biomedical sciences, nursing, ecology, and evolutionary biology. So if the dotted line is above a bar for a particular group, that means that that group is underrepresented in that discipline. And what we've known for some time now is that minoritized students are underrepresented in most fields of biology. However, more recently, researchers are noticing that Black students are severely minoritized, specifically in ecology and evolutionary biology, with only 1% of PhDs going to Black individuals in those fields between 2015 and 2017. So why? Why is it that we have such an absence of students from one race in those fields? Well, in the last 5 years, there have been some studies that have investigated and uncovered hypotheses for why Black students are absent in these fields. A lack of same race role models has been found to be important for Black students' interest in evolutionary biology in multiple studies. And researchers found that Black students had higher discomfort with outdoor environments and less exposure to ecology and evolutionary biology, which led to a lower sense of belonging and interest in those fields. But these studies have also noted that Black students report being much more religious than students from other groups. And religiosity happens to be an extremely impactful factor for whether someone is going to accept evolution. Consider this graph, which breaks down the relationship between accepting and understanding evolution by religiosity levels. So the x-axis here is the number of answers someone gets correct on an evolution knowledge test, while the y-axis is the probability that someone will actually think evolution is true. And as would be expected when teaching most topics in biology, as people understand a topic better, they're likely to accept it and think it's true. However, with evolution, there are gaps between students with different religious identities. So with non-religious students, what we see is if they get 100% on an evolution test, they're almost 100% likely to think that evolution is true. However, for religious individuals, even when they get 100% on an evolution knowledge test, they still only have about a 50-50 chance of accepting evolution. So religiosity can be a really strong barrier for accepting evolution. And research has consistently found that Black and Hispanic folks in the United States are more religious than white people. And although past researchers have suggested that this strong religiosity among these groups may be a factor influencing their difference in evolution acceptance, nobody has actually tested this hypothesis until now. But there's also another factor to take into account. It's not just the strength of religion that matters. There are denominational differences between people from different groups as well. The majority of Black individuals in the United States are Protestant, and only a few percent are Catholic, while almost half of Hispanic individuals are Catholic, and only a minority are Protestant. And this is important because the Catholic Church has long supported the idea of evolution, while the Protestant Church has not shown such consistent support for evolution. So religion may not be as important a factor influencing Hispanic individuals' evolution acceptance as a group compared to Black individuals as a group. So that brings us to our current study. We emailed instructors across the nation and asked them if they'd be willing to forward a survey to their students that included measures of evolution acceptance, religiosity, and a question asking students to indicate their racial or ethnic identity. And we asked, can higher rates of religiosity among Black or Hispanic students explain their lower rates of evolution acceptance? We also collected control measures for potentially confounding factors such as gender, age, and socioeconomic status. And we ended up getting data from almost 10,000 students in 77 classes across 17 US states. This large sample size is what allowed us to disaggregate students of color in our analyses. All right, so what did we find in terms of religiosity? How closely does the college population match the US population? Well, Our students look very similar to what we see in the public. So this is a violin plot of students' levels of religiosity broken down by racial and ethnic identification. The shapes of the violin represent the density of data at that specific point on the y-axis. So for instance, among white students, you see that there is a large number of students who are of average religiosity at the 0 on the y-axis, while the black solid line represents the median of the data. So for instance, the median of Black student religiosity is higher than students from any other racial or ethnic group. You also see, based on the violin plot, that there is a large aggregation of students at the highest point of the religiosity scale compared to students from other racial and ethnic groups. Conversely, there are very few Black students that fall on the low end of the religiosity scale, indicating that very few Black students are not religious. Each letter indicates whether there's a statistically significant difference between groups of students. So if a group shares a letter, they are not statistically different from one another. For instance, Black students do not share a B with any other group because they were found to be statistically significantly more religious than any other racial ethnic group, while Asian and white students share a letter because they had similar levels of religiosity. Okay, so what about their acceptance of evolution? We measured 3 aspects of evolution acceptance because students tend to have different levels of microevolution, macroevolution, and human evolution acceptance. But we found that Black students were less accepting than students from any other racial ethnic groups in all 3 cases. We see the exact opposite pattern of religiosity in that Black students scored lower rather than higher than these other racial ethnic groups. But there was a particularly prominent gap between groups on their acceptance of human evolution scores. So when looking at Black student populations, there are almost no Black students that are highly accepting of human evolution. Further, the median and most dense portion of the distribution of data points lie at a point lower than the overall average of the population and lower than that of students from any other race or ethnicity. But what about our actual research questions? So does the higher religiosity of these students actually explain differences in evolution acceptance? So we used mediation analyses to explore this question, and a mediation analysis helps to determine if the relationship between 2 variables can be explained by a third confounding variable. So in this case, the relationship between race and evolution acceptance may be the result of a third variable, religiosity. So this is a big scary table that gives you a lot of important information about the mediation analysis for those of you in the audience that are more familiar and would like to see that detail. However, for those of you who are not so familiar, I want to bring your attention to a few important numbers. So first is the coefficient for the mediation effect, which is the average change in evolution acceptance that would occur if the measure of religiosity observed among Black or Hispanic students were the same as white students. And what we found is that for Black students, we see there would be a significant change in the evolution acceptance coefficients that were predicted. However, for Hispanic students, we did not see the trend. And the next set of numbers I want to bring is the gap between white and Black students that is accounted for given difference in religiosity scores. We don't show these numbers for Hispanic students because their mediation effect was so low. For Black students, 33% of the gap in microevolution acceptance scores could be explained by higher religiosity levels. And for human evolution acceptance and macroevolution acceptance, this was even more pronounced. Almost half the gap between Black and white student evolution acceptance scores could be explained by religiosity differences between these 2 groups. So, given these data, now I'm going to argue that we need to reduce perceived conflict between religion and to create more inclusive biology education. So students perceive a disproportionate amount of conflict between religion and evolution than actually exists. For instance, one of our recent studies found that over half of students in introductory biology think that people have to be atheists in order to accept evolution, and that this perception was associated with lower evolution acceptance among highly religious students. Further, in the biology community, they have not been particularly welcome of religious individuals, particularly Christians. Our experimental social psychology study showed that biologists can be biased against highly religious Christians and rate highly religious PhD applicants as less likable, less credible, and less hireable than non-religious applicants. And students perceive this bias. Over half of students in one study said they perceived that discrimination against Christians is a problem in science. And Christian graduate students report that their Christianity is a stigmatized identity that they sometimes feel they need to conceal in the context of their biology program. So if we want to improve the diversity of evolutionary biology and ecology, then we're going to have to change these patterns in biology and reduce perceived conflict between religion, biology, and evolution. So how do we actually do that? Well, first, we should highlight relevant role models for students. Same-race role models in a discipline have been shown to be even more important for Black students' sense of belonging than students from other minoritized groups. Joseph Graves is a great scientist to highlight for students. He was the first African-American to earn his PhD in evolutionary biology and advocates tirelessly for inclusion and support of Black students in evolutionary science. We should teach the bounded nature of science and explain that science does not answer questions about morality or the existence of God, but is more appropriate for answering questions about the natural world. Instructors can also teach that science is agnostic and not atheistic. Thomas Henry Huxley was considered Darwin's bulldog for his unwavering defense of evolutionary theory, and he also happened to coin the term agnostic specifically to describe scientific beliefs. He said that agnosticism is the essence of, and it means that we can't say we know or believe things that we have no scientific grounds for claiming, and that this notion not only puts aside popular theology in science, but also popular anti-theology. This makes both the personal belief in atheism and a God compatible with an agnostic science which does not claim either view. We have advocated in the past for biology instructors who are mostly secular and white to use religious cultural competence in evolution education and highlight compatibility between religion and evolution. Cultural competence is the ability of one group to understand and effectively communicate to another group. And if instructors use this to highlight compatibility between religion and evolution, it might help to more effectively communicate evolution to students who have different identities than themselves. I know I'm almost out of time, so I'm going to rush through this last slide. There are some unanswered questions for future research. So religiosity only explained up to half of the gap in evolution acceptance between Black and white students. So there are other factors that should be considered. So for instance, there's a distinct pattern in the history of evolutionary theory that's being used to justify the oppression of racial and ethnic minorities that might also cause distrust in evolution. And also, Black students are individuals and not just a collective, so we need to understand the variation in their lived experiences, which cannot be captured through a quantitatively analyzed survey like we use. We need interview studies to more deeply understand the experiences of Black biology students who are learning evolution. I won't repeat my main points because I'm running out of time, but with that, I will leave that slide up and ask you if you have any questions for me. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Liz. Looks like there are some questions coming in the Q&A. So if you click on the Q&A button, you can see which questions or comments have been offered up.
Okay, I see this is a beautiful violin plot. Yes, I was so happy when I discovered violin plots. They are just a wonderful way to visualize data. Somebody said, could you comment on the omission of Native Americans in studies such as these that compare attitudes or perception? Yes, we just did not have the sample size to look at them. Even with this giant sample size that we had, all of the coefficients for Native American students were so large that there wasn't much that we could actually say about that group. And I was not happy about that.
All right, do we have other questions?
Could people not see the PowerPoint?
There were a few issues with scaling, but that got fixed. So I think,
oh, it did get fixed?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, good. I don't think I see any more unless I'm missing.
Liz, I actually have a question or maybe just a place for you to comment. I'm thinking about some pretty well-known biologists who also happen to be popular science writers. And a couple of them in particular take this very adversarial approach to science and religion. How do we as science educators help to overcome those unnecessary contradictions that I think some of these folks write about and speak about as they're communicating with the non-scientific public?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that highlighting the diversity of viewpoints within the scientific community is going to be hugely important for this. So unfortunately, we have a situation where often a minority of very vocal adversarial scientists are reaching a disproportionate number of the public, than is actually the representation of their voice. And so this is one of the reasons that I really advocate for giving examples of religious scientist role models. In this talk, I highlighted Joseph Graves specifically because I wanted to provide role models for Black students. But there's also the director of the National Institutes of Health, Dr. Francis Collins, who's arguably one of the most important scientists in the United States right now, who self-proclaims as an evangelical Christian and has also created an entire organization that promotes harmony between evolution and religion. So that highlighting the diversity of views within the scientific community to say, hey, these guys aren't everybody in the community. And then also backing it up with the philosophy of science and saying, look, that these individuals are making claims that actually can't be made by the scientific process. Science is agnostic. And so therefore, in your personal life, whether you believe in God, you can still believe in evolution. If you don't believe in God, you can still believe in evolution. That's not something that we as biologists, right, make a call on. So those are, I think, some ways that we can start.
Thanks. Looks like there are a couple of questions coming in the Q&A.
Oh, here we go. Okay. So while belonging is a good idea, new research on inclusion states that the onus is on the educators how they interact with those who feel excluded. Extrapolating this to your study to make our students feel valued specifically for both their religious identity and other things they contribute to our classes. My question is, how are you going about assessing whether your students feel valued or not? That's a really good question. So for the surveys, I haven't had that question, but I have in past studies when I've interviewed mostly white Christian students, so this isn't Black Christian students, we asked them that question, how have you felt valued in the biology community given your religion? Unfortunately, most of the time they don't, and they don't have a lot of instances where they have, but in the instances when they have, it's been when other religious scientists have revealed their identity to them, or when people give them recognition of their religious beliefs and how it might be of value in their life. So in those rare instances when that has happened, that's when students said that they feel more valued. All right, do we have another one? Where can we find resources about scientists that we can highlight? Oh, that's a really good question. I actually don't, so BioLogos is a great organization and they have a lot of examples of Christian scientists that are religious. I don't know of any other resources that highlight like people from all sorts of different religions, but there are role models from Muslim religions. Dr. Fatima Jackson won the Lifetime Charles Darwin Award. That's an example. But that's an interesting idea. Maybe there should be a repository somewhere where people can offer up their profiles and we can show examples of diversity of religion within biology. Thank you for that.
It does take a little time for people to type in their questions because it's a little slower than just speaking. So we'll give people a little more time to do that.
Sure, yeah. Thank you for these questions so far. They're great.
I do have a question while we're waiting for others to come in. How do you think intersectionality might be able to mediate the effects of religiosity?
Oh, that's so interesting that you unlocked the secret slide. Yay, you unlocked the secret slide. So yeah, we tested, so this idea of intersectionality is an idea that there's a compounding negative effect on an outcome, right? So the hypothesis would be that if being Christian is a negative effect on accepting evolution, and also holding a Black identity, is a negative effect. Maybe this compounds, and when you're both, the gap is even worse. But we actually did not see evidence of that. What these graphs show here is that when Black students are just as religious as white students, they tend to be about the same levels of accepting of evolution. So what that means is it's really just the fact that so many more Black students are religious and so many more of them are highly religious that makes the difference. Thank you for that question.
And it looks like both Stanley and Cole have added some resources that people might want to look into
Oh, great.
about other axes of diversity and religious representations.
Thank you. I'm going to have to take a look at that too.
Right, any other questions or comments?
Elizabeth, one thing I'm curious about is, did you investigate at all the extent to which people in different denominations take a position on sort of scriptural literalism? Because it seems like that actually could be a discriminating factor between like how much conflict you perceive. You know, look, I'm out of my depth here, so I don't know, but I was just curious about that.
So that's a really good question. We did not measure in this study the extent to which students interpret the Bible literally, but that is, given what we know from previous studies, it is likely that there is a difference in denominational affiliation that correlates with whether or not you read the Bible literally. So for instance, in Catholic denominations, you see a lot less of biblical literalism among those members than you do among Protestant traditions. And because of the fact that we saw that the majority of Black students were from Protestant traditions, while almost half of Hispanic students were from Catholic traditions, I would be willing to bet that you would be right, and that would be a factor that would discern these two groups of students, and you know, whether it explains their levels of acceptance of evolution.
Elizabeth, thank you. This was so interesting. I just had a quick question that I didn't know if you had thought about or if anybody else had looked into. But I know a lot of the time the language we use in science matters, right? Students oftentimes use the sort of the definition of theory that's the popular definition. And, you know, similarly, when we talk about believing in evolution, as if evolution itself is a faith-based practice, as opposed to using more terminology like accepting evolution. Has your group looked into that at all? Or is that something that you're aware of that anybody has?
So I think that there's a lot that's been written about this in the evolution education literature about encouraging instructors to use these terms of accepting. My experience with students themselves is that it doesn't really matter to them what you call it. It doesn't matter if you call it accepting or believing. Either way, to them, they are just saying whether or not they think evolution is true. Right. And I think it's important for us when we're teaching the nature of science and what counts as evidence for science. You know, you accept the evidence or you reject the evidence, versus when it comes to more faith-based issues, a more appropriate terminology is I believe in, you know, something like this. But as far as whether it impacts their actual level of acceptance, I have not seen any evidence of that personally, although I will say that I don't think it's been well tested in the evolution education literature.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much, Liz. If everyone would join me in thanking Liz once more.
Thank you all so much. This was such a great opportunity. So I should stop sharing my screen now?
Yep, so let's stop sharing your screen and then we will transition over to Stanley Lowe, our fourth speaker.
Hello, everyone. I'm just unmuting myself and getting my screen set up here.
So while Stanley is doing that, Stanley and his colleagues, Nicole Suarez and Stacy Bridges, all of University of California, San Diego, are going to tell us about their nationwide study of instructor conceptions of diversity in higher education.
Yeah, thank you, Sue-Ann, and thank you everyone for joining us here today. I'm gonna, as Sue-Ann said, I'm gonna talk a little bit about our current ongoing work about understanding how faculty and instructor conceptualize diversity in higher education. And just like our session started, I want to acknowledge Southern California as a research site. So as you can see here, Southern California, and part of Baja California in Mexico. For millennia, the Kumeyaay people have been a part of this land, and the land has nourished, healed, and protected and embraced them for many generations in a relationship of balance and harmony. And so we want to acknowledge this legacy and promote this balance and harmony, and which is the land of the Kumeyaay. And I also want to acknowledge, as Sue-Ann has brought up, these were the projects actually led by two very accomplished and talented graduate students in math and science education, Nicole Suarez and Song Wong, as well as this was done in collaboration with my colleague Stacy Bridges in chemistry and biochemistry. The project supported by a number of NSF grants on different professional development projects with 2 and 4 year 2 and 4 year institutions. And we want to thank all the study participants for, of course, contributing their time and sharing their experience, which otherwise would not have made this study possible. And so first, I want to start by thinking about why we should care about diversity in higher education. Of course, there's a lot of ongoing national and discourse about this as well. But more focused on higher education, the literature has shown that instructor approaches to teaching and learning have important impact on student outcomes. And an equity or opportunity gap continues to exist for minoritized students who are from specific backgrounds in terms of how they persist and in higher education. And a lot of this has been attributed to negative campus climate, particularly experienced through microaggressions, faculty mindset, and stereotype threat. And instructors directly interact with students and are really positioned to facilitate an inclusive classroom culture. And so it's really important, right, to really understand and examine how different instructors experience and conceptualize diversity in their classrooms. And so our objective here is to really understand, right, examine and understand how different instructors experience and conceptualize diversity in their classroom. And as the research objective, and as researchers, what we're really trying to understand is that experience and conceptualization. So we're not really studying the phenomenon of diversity in higher education, and we're not particularly studying the instructors themselves. What we're really trying to understand is that conceptualization process and their experience and how they understand diversity. And this particular approach is called phenomenography. In particular, what we're trying to do is describe the variations in these experiences and the aspects of features of the phenomenon that give rise to or lead to these variations. And the data were collected through semi-structured interviews with 30 full-time and part-time instructors at 9 2-year and 4-year minority serving institutions. These instructors were from a variety of disciplines, from STEM to social science and humanities. So in particular, these were pretty intentional samples with people who are at minority serving institutions, in particular that their classroom are likely to be a much more diverse setting compared to perhaps other institutions. We were inclusive in terms of full-time and part-time colleagues, as well as at many different institutions, because diversity as a phenomenon really span across disciplines beyond biology and STEM. Even though this particular study has a lot of different disciplines and departments represented in it, we think it would still be useful and applicable in a biology setting in our conversations in teaching undergraduate biology. The semi-structured interview protocol were set up to explore conceptions and approaches to teaching, learning, and diversity. And the semi-structured part allows for the participants to elaborate and the interviewer to probe further what they're thinking about these issues. And data analysis followed a grounded theory approach. So if you think about the interview data, there's a rich set of qualitative data that can look very messy. And through iterative analysis at different stages, at open coding, where this information is really broken down, examined, and compared and conceptualized to really form codes and categories. And then in the next stage, the data were assembled into new ways, by making connections among the codes and categories. And finally, through selective codings, we are identifying a core set of categories, or those aspects or features that I mentioned, as well as the variations among how individuals experience those aspects, to develop a new model or new theory in understanding how people conceptualize diversity. And as others have described, right, a lot of this work is influenced by the positionality and identity of the researchers. So I'd like to point out that, as part of the research team, we come from a variety of race and ethnicity, as well as educational backgrounds, and we also have a number of international scholars involved who are not, from a United States education background. And also, I'd like to point out, in terms of validity, this work has, we have weekly ongoing meetings that allows us to cross-check, our work from the core researcher, as well as we have, presented this on at a number of settings, both internally on campus and externally, to a wide variety of STEM educators, education researchers, and discipline-based education researchers, as well as instructors who are, directly in the classroom. And so, that is supporting both communicative and pragmatic validity in this case. So what I want to start by describing is the different aspects of features that instructors attend to. There are 5 different aspects that emerged from our data. The first 2 here relates to how an instructor interprets student characteristics and the diversity of student features. And as the second one, we highlight how an instructor views student intelligence, which could also be part of student characteristics, but the intelligence mindset stood out as an important aspect that a lot of the instructors actually talked about and highlighted in their interviews. And this leads to 2 other aspects about the learning environment and pedagogical actions. So how and instructors might perceive the impact of student diversity in their classrooms, and then what they can do about it, right? So what they understand as their role in teaching students and approaching that diversity in their classrooms. And finally, we want to bring in this idea called legitimized membership, essentially how instructor positions students within higher education. Just like many other things, just like intelligence mindset, we're borrowing that for a lot from psychology and, for example, from Carol Dweck's work. Legitimized membership is actually an idea that was developed for K-12 STEM education by Edna Tan and Angie Calabrese-Barton. Really thinking about how students are positioned within our education system. And so we borrowed some of these ideas as the data emerged, right? We borrowed some of these ideas to help us make sense of the information that we're getting from our interview data. And so what I'm going to do is, because of the limitation of time, I'm not going to go through all 5 aspects in detail. What I'm going to do is talk about the student characteristics and legitimized memberships, and then circle back to looking at everything together. So what we found is that there are 3 major ways that instructors look at student characteristics and interpret them as an aspect of diversity. The first interpretation we called static, and here, as in the excerpt, the instructor talked about linguistics diversity and how this instructor considers that some of their Chinese students may have been great in terms of effort, but this person also questions whether the students understood a word that they were saying, and they're not sure why they're there if they don't understand the language of instruction, and that's an aspect of diversity. And so in this case, the excerpt, focuses on linguistics diversity, but the interpretation is that this diversity is sort of static, right? If the students don't understand English, for example, if they're international students or foreign students, then it's unclear why they are even in the classroom from this instructor's perspective. And then the next conception is attending to student characteristics is focusing on these characteristics as malleable. In this case, this person talks about student backgrounds, such as having good high school backgrounds or not, and that provides them with the background to engage in the reading. And this person talks about this diversity of backgrounds is always a challenge for them, and they always are sympathetic, so they try to make things as accessible as possible. And so it highlights that the characteristics or the backgrounds are malleable and can be changed. And so if we apply this to the linguistic diversity that came up earlier, right, a person with this particular conception may consider the linguistic diversity malleable as well, right? So we're not saying that certain characteristics are static or malleable. What's important here is how an individual interprets and works with those characteristics. And then finally, the last conceptualization focuses on these characteristics as lived experiences. So this person talks about how they are not able to sit with all 200 students and find out what their backgrounds are. And by background, they include the stories that these students' families might tell, and how that might influence the way they approach an assignment or how they were taught to approach an assignment in high school. So all of this is an individualized, lived experiences of each student, and the fact that they come from different backgrounds, have had different opportunities until they walk through the door in higher education, might affect how they feel confident or might feel like an imposter around campus. And similarly, in terms of legitimized memberships, we found that there are 3 different ways that instructors view this aspect of diversity. And so the first one is really positioning student as an outsider. So in this case, the person said when they give a midterm and they would say, we did all these problems, how come the students don't know how to do them? Because the first expectation for this person, for this instructor, is that when they teach and everything they say, students should know how to do. And this person assumes that they know how to do it, and if students don't know how to do that, they're not doing the minimum. And so essentially here, right, the onus is put on the students to do the work and to navigate the college process. The next conceptualization focuses students as guests and how they might have difficulties in reading and trying to prepare. And here, right, they're providing the support and tools for students to engage in the process. And so the students are positioned as guests in that, instructors provide the support, but the university is not really their space. And finally, in terms of rightful presence, students are really positioned as belonging and rightfully present at the university or higher education. So this person says they want to invite students into the exploration process to make them feel like they could be experts about some part of it. There is so much about the discourse of academic English that is still couched in a really waspy white way. If we assume that's the only knowledge to value and for people to present or display that knowledge, then we're immediately or automatically cutting people out who don't present or speak that way. So essentially, there are 3 conceptions of diversity. The first one we termed essentialist. Basically, the qualities or characteristics are static or fixed, and which leads to thinking about diversity as irrelevant or an impediment in the learning environment, and focusing on maybe a equal treatment that is often ascribed to what's called a colorblind ideology, right? And then that ultimately positions students as outsiders. The middle conception we termed functionalist because it's focusing on characteristics being malleable and can be improved. It focuses on students' strengths and weaknesses and accommodations for weaker students, and positions students as guests where we provide the support, but it's not, the higher education space is not really theirs. They come through and then they graduate and they go away. And the last one we termed existentialist, which focuses on lived experiences as assets, and there's reciprocity of how students can learn from one another's lived experiences. There's intentional implementation to center social justice issues or equity issues within the discipline in the curriculum, and ultimately, positions students as rightfully present in higher education. And so I just want to sort of point out that we also look at diversity. We touched on how it might relate to learning, classrooms, curriculum, assessment, and intelligence. We have additional work that looks into how people conceptualize these areas as well as thinking about research mentoring and the professoriate. And essentially, we think that the conceptions of teaching actually then connects with all of these other domains, but also connects to what people actually do in the classroom. So I just want to wrap up here. I'm happy to take questions. I know I'm probably a little bit over. You can feel free to type into the Q&A for questions, but I also want to invite everyone to share one idea from this research that you might incorporate in your work, and you can type directly into the chat for that as well. And so again, thank you for having me here today. I'm happy to take questions.
So give people some time to type the different things that you have requested, as well as put questions in the chat. We do have a few minutes here. I have a feeling people are thinking.
Yeah, that's totally fine. Yes.
While people are thinking, if I may ask a question?
Yeah, of course.
So you did look at all sorts of different disciplines. Did you find any trends in a discipline versus another?
Yeah, so the short answer is maybe, and because the goal isn't really to really establish differences. 30 people is a pretty good size qualitative interview study. At the same time, it's not a big enough sample size to make the kind of conclusion, generalizable conclusion about disciplinary differences. We could certainly count them up and it would have a number. I'm just not sure if the numbers would actually answer your question. So the short answer is we don't quite know, unfortunately.
Well, do you expect any if you were to, be able to go big?
Yeah, so I think what part of the next step is we want to develop a survey so we can, do a much larger scale study. I think, what you see, right, some of the quotes that I shared, obviously people highlight or I guess reveal some of their disciplinary differences, but we did see, the existentialist conception from colleagues from essentially different disciplines. So the one who talked about English obviously is working in English and writing. We have an engineering colleague, maybe, in a conventional sense, those are maybe the opposite extremes you can think of, right? But we have, also have engineering colleagues who talked about intentional implementation, about how, for example, historically, crash test dummies for cars were all built for the average male bodies. And so it turns out that in accidents, women tend to sustain much severe injuries and tend to have higher mortality rates in car accidents until this kind of equity issues are addressed, and this colleague intentionally brings these examples and conversations into her mechanical engineering classrooms.
Thanks, Stanley.
Stanley, I have a question as well, if I might.
Yeah, of course.
I recognize that the type of study that you've done here is very resource intensive, and consequently your sample size is relatively small. But I was just wondering if you saw any patterns related to the diversity of the instructors. In other words, does their race, ethnicity, other factors of their identity influence the way that they see their students' diversity? I don't know if that question makes sense.
Yeah, I think it makes sense. I think, and in part, some of that intentional sampling at minority serving institutions was focused on the student, or at least the explicit or overt student diversity, right? We do have demographic information of the interview participants, and again, right, it is a small sample size, and we did see people from all kinds of demographics falling under essentially any of the three conceptions. Again, because of the research goal and the sample size, we decided not to do the sort of counting, right? Because again, obviously we can count them and it would give us a number, but we're not entirely confident that it's actually like it would answer the question. But yeah, so some of the next steps I think is going to be, again, developing a survey that allows us to approach the kinds of numbers that some of the earlier presenters have done in their studies.
Cool, thank you.
Do we have any other questions, thoughts? Are people really crafting these really excellent statements to put into the chat? It is enabled. I think you should be able to do that if you all would like.
Looks like we do have a question that just came in.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, thanks for the clarification. So the question is, for grounded theory interviews, don't we usually shoot for 20 to 30 and then go on if we need saturation? Why are we calling this a small sample? Yeah, so let me clarify. This is a really good point. So I'm not calling this a small sample for this study. I'm calling it a small sample for to address the questions that that Bill and Sue-Ann had come up, which is a more generalizable answer of is there a disciplinary difference? Do people in some disciplines, or do people of certain personal demographics like race or ethnicity or gender would skew towards one conception versus another? So that's a good point to clarify. And we did reach saturation because we actually did do and I should have mentioned that. So thank you for bringing that up. We did the interviews over the course of 2 years in multiple sort of chunks, and as we got to the end of the interview, we stopped because the last few rounds of interviews, there were essentially no new data or new codes emerging from the data.
Stanley, can I ask you a question?
Yeah, of course, Cole.
So I'm curious about, it does seem that there's this sort of bad, medium, good valence to the three types of instructor mind profiles that you created. And I wonder, do you think that there is a risk in sort of building this template out that we're going to start to develop a sense that instructors need to be slotted into one of these categories and then they're stuck there forever? Is there a risk that we end up reifying that typology and putting people in boxes as a sort of unintended consequence? I don't know. I'm not saying I think that I'm just wondering if that's something that's you guys are thinking about.
Yeah, I think I think part of the challenge is, right, yes, always when you categorize something, then it becomes, right, like a category, which is sort of like a double-edged sword, or like a self-fulfilling prophecy, or whatever, loop you want to call it. I think in many ways, when we've presented this more as a workshop for people to engage with the interview excerpts and come up with their own sort of patterns, oftentimes what we've seen is that when we've done it in those kind of workshop formats, people do come up with like roughly those three conceptualizations, but a lot of times what people would also say is like, oh, I want to be more like that colleague who talked about the crash test dummies, right? And even though I'm not in mechanical engineering, like what is the equivalent of that in my discipline, and how I can move towards that, right? So I think, maybe I'm too, I have faith in human beings. I think people tend to be like seeing the possibilities would allow people to be more aspirational to achieve different, or move towards the more complete conceptions of really viewing student diversity as lived experiences and rightful presence.
Right, thank you, Stanley. And now I think we have reached the end of our 4 presenters, and so now to shift gears, I'm going to turn this over to my co-chair, Bill Hayborn.
Great, thanks, Sue-Ann. We have the great fortune of including in our research symposium today the 2020 NABT Biology Education Awardee. And so we have invited Dr. Amanda Glaze-Krampus to present her work with us for us today. So Amanda, if you want to start gearing up and sharing your slides, all that sort of thing, I'll continue with the introduction here. Dr. Glaze-Krampus is Assistant Professor of Science Education in the Department of Middle Grades and Secondary Education at Georgia Southern University. She wears several hats in the NABT organization, works extensively as an editor for the American Biology Teacher, and is the 2018 NABT Evolution Education Awardee. So a 2-time awardee here with us today. We're so excited to have Amanda with us. And the title of her presentation today is Barriers, Beliefs, and Border Crossings, Worldview and the Pursuit of Scientific Literacy. So Amanda, we will turn it over to you.
And leave it to me to be the person that has to be told they're on mute, right? So thank you all very much. Very excited to have the opportunity to not only share what it is that I do, but absolutely floored to receive the Biology Education Research Award this year. It's been amazing being a part of this community and seeing the awesome work that colleagues are doing throughout the 4-year and 2-year group. And so to be recognized by my colleagues really means a tremendous deal. Now, let me see if I can get the screen share to work. And I love that I can never see what I'm sharing. So what does that look like? Do we see it?
You've got it.
All right. So that's a win in and of itself. So as Bill was saying, my name is Amanda Glaze-Krampus, and I am an assistant professor at Georgia Southern University. And evolution education has become, to me, so much more than just a research line, as it's something that I've actually extensively lived and experienced when it comes to navigating the controversy and the conflict that is often perceived in the public as it relates to evolution education. So the issue that we have is that it's widely agreed upon that evolution education is one of the great barriers when it comes to science education. So that's primarily been focused at the K-12 level. We know that grade school experiences because of a variety of reasons. So younger school primary often is a content issue because our elementary teachers don't feel confident in the content. We get to middle and high school and we start getting that pushback with challenge that takes place. But one thing that we don't always take into account is that the issues that happen as early as primary education and secondary are often persistent into undergraduate and even professional level education, whether it's our education students, our science majors, our non-majors, because very frequently those misconceptions, misperceptions, and that misinformation is not addressed at any point prior. And if that's not happening, we have people going into fields that have persistent issues as it relates to things like evolution. And there are a lot of areas of need. Liz Barnes, I came in a little bit at the end of your presentation today, but I've had the absolute pleasure of watching Liz work her magic, and Sarah and Lee and so many others across the country. We're figuring this out. And, even recently in the last month, the National Center for Science Education released a very positive piece on the impact that we're starting to see on evolution education across levels as a result of the effort that people are putting in. But one of the things that quite a few of us are focusing on is that concept of worldview as a part of this. For so long, we have looked at science critically because that's what we do. But we fail to recognize that there are factors that are outside of that realm of rationalization that strongly impact the things that are taking place within our students, in the classrooms, and even in public conversation. So I think everybody that's had anything to do with science has followed this Gallup poll on public evolution and how it's been, largely unchanged or with only minor shifts even over the last 30 years, that there's still a very high percent of the population that associates their thinking with creationist leaning, that another chunk of that, but slightly less, is interested in the concept of theistic evolution. And of course, fewer than 20% were looking at evolution through a lens that is secular. So, we can take from this, what we're doing or what we've been doing historically is really not having the large scale public impact that we would like for it to have. And so with most things, the more you know, the more you're accepting. I see this happening, I'm looking at the evidence, I'm hearing about it, I can process it fairly simply, as long as it is in parallel with that worldview that I hold, with those intrinsic beliefs and values. But this is one of those situations in science, of many, that doesn't necessarily parallel to people's values, morals, and worldview ideals. And therefore, being able to get at the issues that cause things like rejection of evolution requires a slightly more nuanced view and approach than just saying, okay, you don't accept this, so you must not know about it. Let me tell you all the things you need to know, and then everything's okay. We have to go beyond that. And so in the last 3 decades of research, we've really seen this huge uptick in kind of a blended approach to tackling this issue. So many of us, despite having bench science backgrounds, are leaning more into this kind of social science narrative. So it's this in-between world that exists when you consider things that, again, like Liz was talking about earlier, we have to differentiate between what is our goal. Is it knowledge? Is it understanding? How do we differentiate between things like beliefs and acceptance? That semantics, it really does matter. Now, while we may not sit and think about the language that we use, and you may not have a student who comes and says, well, you said acceptance instead of belief, so now I'm totally cool with it. It's not going to be this magical moment. But what we are finding through research and through working with science professors, with teachers, with students, conversations with undergraduate students, is that how we frame the situation has a lot of power in setting the tone for the entire conversation. So even if it's not that magical aha moment, it can actually help others who are hearing us talk about evolution and teach about something with which they may have strong discomfort. It almost diffuses this little bit of a bomb of worldview conflict that exists. So we know that worldview is an identity construct. It's very much a part of who we are, that our positionality actually has to do with whether something butts heads with that worldview, comes into alignment, you know, and we really have to look at beyond just teaching content. What things can we do that create a space of openness? We do this for everything else. Anything else that's identity related, we want to create a space for openness, but we very often don't create that same space for things like worldview, culture, and religious beliefs or religiosity, because it feels uncomfortable or it seems like it's in conflict with the very nature of science. But there's a difference between saying there is a controversy, let's talk about what science is and what science is not and what are the bounds of science, then the concept of teach the controversy, which has been so highly popularized over the last few decades. But then, of course, we also have misunderstandings, misconceptions, and misinformation. So each of these areas is a power area that comes into play. Now, I am talking about evolution specifically, but if we're really being honest, this is not a conversation about evolution and religion. This is not a conversation about beliefs versus science. This is a conversation about scientific literacy. Because if we can select and cherry pick one element, then all of a sudden it's okay to do two. And then it's okay to do three. And then the next thing you know, it's 2020 and we've got this COVID situation, we've got climate change, we've got all these things. And we have a situation in the general public that is fraught with distrust and concern and not even understanding the process. We see it play out consistently in the news every day. So it's very much a war for science literacy and so much bigger than just a conversation about evolution. So a lot of us are doing this research in different pockets around the country. And my particular pocket, although I'm doing national study as well, is here in the southeastern United States. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that it is the culture that I came up in. Those that know me closely know that I was actually born and reared in a Southern Baptist ministry missions family. And so I came up through the experience that is very familiar to a lot of people that I talk with in the community, that evolution is truly considered in this part of the country at large scale a taboo. And so when we think about the concept of taboo from anthropological lens, you know, we're thinking about, you know, the dark ages, things that go bump in the night. And it's hard for us to process that in 2020, there is a word that you can go out and I could walk across the road and say to my neighbor, hey, what do you know about evolution? And get a literal visceral response in return. But that very much exists, and it makes the southeastern United States a very interesting place to study this phenomenon, because we do have such a large part of the underpinning culture that is evangelical Protestant literalist interpretation of biblical considerations. And so that permeates the curriculum, it permeates conversation, it permeates community, because church here in the South is largely a part of a familial structure, not just a place that you go to periodically. So it's interesting to note that that place is very important, and it's actually a framework called significance of place, because students in the South are 84% less likely to get meaningful instruction in evolution. Very frequently, when your students come into a college class, they've never talked about evolution in their classroom, or what they get is very much the washed down version of, we have biodiversity, animals adapt, bye, that's all we're going to talk about. So it's either not very meaningful, or it often takes place not at all. So 10 times more likely, if you're a student from the South, to have had no instruction whatsoever relative to evolution. I will even add that in many of our states here, 2 states I work very heavily in, Alabama and Georgia, Alabama put the word evolution in their standards for the first time historically in 2016. So it's still very much a highly contentious thing. But that culture really frames understandings. It frames how we view the world. It's that lens through which every other thing we experience is going to come into play. And it really makes sense if you think about it in terms of, if I walk in the door and I tell somebody, hey, all those people that you trust and love, that you have spent your entire life listening to and valuing their thoughts and opinions, they told you X, and I'm going to tell you Y, and X is wrong. We're going to make a lot of headway with that, right? They're just going to magically listen and accept everything that we're saying, and it's beautiful. But this is something in science that uniquely captures Christian literalism and biblical literalism or textual literalism of other religious beliefs as well, because it specifically ties into human construct in terms of where that fits with change, with special creation and whatnot. So it's very unique in how it plays out. And it requires a nuance to really move through it. So understanding it requires understanding a culture that many people are not familiar with, many people are not comfortable with. And, you know, it's very much getting into otherness when you start looking at these communities and really trying to connect with the power that that community has in the learning process, even into our adult years when we're talking about undergraduate and graduate level education. So I always like the idea that, you know, as scientists, we're willing to revisit constantly. We're constantly reflecting and reworking our approach. And this is something that's very important because I like to talk about the idea of minding the gaps. You know, we see these massive gaps between, as I said before, the idea of science versus faith, left versus right, you know, this idea versus that. And it's perpetuated greatly. And it often puts us at a disadvantage where we're either yelling into our own echo chambers or we're yelling at the other side of a chasm and we're not really doing anything to build a bridge in between. The project I think that I'm happiest about at the moment is a national undergraduate study on evolution. And so it's actually targeted at introductory and majors level classes. So it runs a gambit across courses, the number of courses that have been taken, whether people are majors or non-majors, where they're coming from. And it's intended to kind of look at some of the assumptions we've been making about, does it fit? So for example, Liz and Sarah are conducting research in Arizona. I'm conducting research here in the South. We talk frequently or look at the results that we have, but the bigger question is, does it fit? Does what works for a, you know, Southern Christian evangelical group of students have the same impact in a Jesuit group of students who are in Arizona who have come up in a completely separate culture? And so the idea here was to get a baseline that we can then apply to other research. So it targets a very wide range of participants. We're now at over 25,000 undergraduate students representing 111 universities in all 50 states and Puerto Rico. We did use some familiar measures, even though there are some criticisms. So, you know, the MATE is one that has been extensively used in other studies. So we did deploy the MATE just so that we could talk about, okay, this is where this group goes compared to past studies. But we also deployed the new measure, the gene, the third modification of the gene, which has recently been revalidated with a larger sample and some adjustments made to address criticisms of that as well. In addition to a content exploration and nature of science exploration, since a lot of the research has agreed that nature of science is one thing we can address in science classes to get at some of the misconceptions and misinformation that's out there about evolution. So we're actually in analysis at present, and it's been very exciting. We've pulled some test polls to give a little bit of an idea of where things are coming out since we're pre-publication. But for example, we have demographics. Our demographics are extremely disheartening when it comes to racial background. We're actually exploring this because we have such a large representation of Caucasian participants and a little bit less when it comes to the breakdown of students in other underrepresented groups. We do actually have a higher rate of return for females than we have of males. Apparently sophomores run from science classes. So we had an interesting breakdown in terms of the numbers that fleshed out across across years of study. But it gives a little bit of an idea of where our students are falling and something to compare to the national body once we're completely done with closing out the data, which is coming up in December. So we'll be able to actually run these against, or run our final demographics against the national averages for gender, race for our student participants. So looking at how undergraduate students compare to some existing populations, which we thought would be interesting. So a study that I conducted with colleagues in 2015 looked specifically at these similar measures with pre-service teachers. And so with our pre-service teachers, we actually at that time were using the MATE. So we used a conversion based on validation to get an equivalent gene to match with the undergraduate gene. So you can see that among professional students in education who were science majors as well, we see a pretty consistent moderate acceptance of evolution, which, some people say, well, they're moderately accepting. That's great. It's not 70% as a test grade. It's literally saying that they're willing to throw away a third of it if they don't like it. So when you think about it in that context, it's a little bit frightening that we certainly have a lot of parts of evolution that people are more interested in and more willing to consider, but we still have a lot of work to do in terms of where people stop cherry picking, so to speak, that they can agree with one part as long as it doesn't apply to human evolution, which is usually the breakdown. As far as content knowledge, it's rather dismal. So that is actually a test score on a content knowledge examination of what we would consider introductory level evolution content based on framework concepts of evolutionary instruction. So we're talking about Darwinian evolution, Hardy-Weinberg. We're not even getting into anything too complicated, but our future teachers had an average score of 37.6. The snapshot that we pulled, the representative snapshot of 5,856 students from the undergrad study, their average score was a 43. So that's definitely areas to work on in terms of content. What's interesting to focus on is this concept of nature of science. So we hear about the nature of science frequently because it literally is the study of what science is and how it is done. And we know from research in science education that explicitly teaching the nature and process of science as we are teaching the content is a powerful tool that not only gets at misconceptions and helps students conceptualize the discovery elements, the actionable process elements of science on a deeper level, but it's also useful in navigating a lot of the issues that we have, like the idea of laws versus theories. What is the definition of a law, which, we all know evolution is just a theory, right? That's frequently used. At the idea of science being completely objective, which it's certainly not. The concept of science as a field of uncertainty that is about explaining phenomenon, but never really saying anything is 100% proven because it's self-correcting, right? So all of these are things that are widely used against scientific concepts as arguments against them, when in reality, they're the strength of what science is, what it does, and what the boundaries of science are. Interestingly, many pre-service programs in the US are now explicitly adding nature of science instruction into what they're doing with teacher candidates to help prepare them to navigate these things in the classroom. So that's one of the measures of interest. And we did note that between samples, we actually have a higher nature of science understanding with our pre-service teachers than what we have with undergraduate students. So it's going to be very interesting once the regression analyses are run to see if that nature of science score impacts acceptance of evolution as strongly in undergraduate students who are not in education settings as it has in some groups who are in education settings, where we're frequently seeing nature of science as the strongest predictor outside of religiosity for whether or not a person accepts evolution and is willing to apply it outside of or apply it in conversation, or be willing to support evolution with others. One of the things we also wanted to look at this with this study, as I said before, is how does region impact whether or not this is the measures or the ideas that we have from other studies can be generalized. So we have a lot of studies in the Northeast. We now have a cluster in the South. We now have some clusters out West, but there are a lot of gaps that are in between all of those. And sometimes, you read in the literature, you've got great ideas, you're really feeling what you're seeing, but then you have that question of, but will it work the same here because X? And so looking at a poll of confounding contexts is the region of the South compared to the national average. So this is again a 25% test pool, so just under 6,000 participants from the national study. And you can see there is a much stronger percentage of acceptance. So one would be considered low acceptance, the other at the national level is considered moderate. The content knowledge, ironically, is a little bit higher. And then the nature of science understanding was also a little bit higher. So I think we're going to find some very curious interactions. Someone had asked me when I first presented this idea in conversation, well, aren't you shocked that they seem to know more, but they accept less? And honestly, the answer is no, because we know from the research that we don't have a highly predictable relationship between knowledge and acceptance of evolution, because there are plenty of people who know a whole lot about evolution, could make a 100 on the content test, but then they actively elect to reject it, to practice this cognitive rejection because it doesn't align with those closely held worldviews that, again, are that lens through which we evaluate everything. So similarly, in the flip side of that, there are plenty of people that are wholly accepting of evolution, but know very little actually about it. So it's very interesting to see the disconnect that can exist between the idea of knowledge, understanding, and acceptance. And it's one of those things that makes it critical that we not make an assumption of ignorance when someone presents with low acceptance of evolution. So this is one of the current and future projects that I'm involved in. And as I said, we're closing out our data collection at the end of December. We have some early eyes on snapshots of where it is going. But the idea is to create a baseline so that we can look across regions, but also to identify areas where we have higher acceptance and we have higher knowledge, and we can look at what programs are doing independently that might be of use and open for us to come in and study, why does X work so well in this setting? Why does Y not work in this setting? So it really gives us the ability, or will give us the ability, to compare what's going on across the country and kind of create a unified view that we can use as a foundation for future research. So some of the research that's already underway or in progress that relates to pockets of this are Teaching Evolution Through Human Examples, which is a project that was in the Northeast with Smithsonian Institution that developed materials for teaching human and non-human evolution. The Learning Evolution Through Human Examples project which is actually testing those materials in the southeastern United States to see if they work. And so a lot of these are developed to be at the introductory college level. So they're useful for high school teachers, for AP and things like that, but also could be useful for undergraduate students. Included in that is a culturally responsive strategy booklet that's free for anyone to use that actually helps navigate some of these issues in a way that does not push the controversy. So it allows people to explore different coping mechanisms and helps foster conversations about science as a way of knowing. And then a new project called Expanding Teaching and Understanding of Diverse Evolutionary Studies that builds on some of the work of the Evolutionary Working Group at the University of Alabama in looking at bridging across content areas in teaching evolution and creating experiences for students at the undergraduate level and up to allow them to explore evolution through the lens of evidence outside of just biology. So it actually brings in social sciences, anthropology, really anybody and everybody that's willing to come and get involved in it. But it opens it up to something so much more than just what we do with, descent with modification in biology. So it applies it outward. So in summation, the things that I feel through research have really become important is that we have to always remember to build bridges, because every interaction that we have as scientists, as professors, as teachers, in the public and conversation is an opportunity to help with scientific literacy, to help people be more trusting of science. But we have to recognize there are unseen factors that exist in our discourse. And so everything from the semantics of the words that we use to our body language to how we approach the topic can say a lot more and cause issues instead of helping where we want to fix things. That in order to do this, we often have to stop what we're doing and seek first to understand, then be understood. It's easy to make assumptions about the people that we're interacting with, assumptions about what our students bring to the table. But a part of that is finding out what they bring to the table and then being able to navigate that as a group, even in large group settings. That evidence has very limited power to move the masses. I think we have unfortunately seen this on a very large scale in the last year, but that personal voice is what matters. So it has to be something more than just throwing evidence at people in order to make change take place. And that we certainly have to make sure we're stepping out of our echo chambers and focus that attention on the middle ground, because the middle ground is where the magic is happening. These are people that could fall in either direction based on the interactions that they have. And if we're not the positive interactions that encourage them to open up and be willing to explore something that to many people is actually legitimately scary, then they're just going to continue to persist in their misinformation, misunderstanding, or mistrust of science until we reach that. So I always say, when you set your sights, make bold adjustments. I have had the benefit of working with amazing people and having amazing opportunities and incredible colleagues. And we're all in this together, kind of picking apart our understandings of conflict and working in tandem in these nice little overarching bubbles to try to be a solution to this issue. But always looking for new opportunities to expand on our understanding and have that impact and that long-term change. So again, being recognized by colleagues and having the things that I'm doing as well as that many others of us are doing, it's so important and so tremendously appreciated. And it really does give us fuel for the fire to keep on going with this, even when sometimes it's a little contentious. So thank you.
Amanda, thank you very much. I think everybody's doing the virtual clap. Cole's doing the snaps there. We need to be cognizant of time here. This Zoom channel is going to be used for another symposium in just a few minutes. So we need to be off of here by 3:30. However, Amanda, there is a couple of comments and then one question that has come in on the question and answer. It might be interesting if you'd address that question there.
Certainly. Let me see if I can pull it up. Okay. Let's see. Oklahoma trumps Alabama, adding the word evolution this year. Yes, evolution is not will occur in the state of Oklahoma. Yeah, you know, there are a lot of people that feel that way in Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia as well, that evolution happens everywhere else. Just a funny, I was actually came up in the same community as Roy Moore and had the opportunity to counter his argument that evolution causes drive-by shootings. So that's a whole other can of worms. But yes, Julie, I completely understand. So the question is
the third one down there from Kristen.
There it popped up. How does research fit with cognitive psychology concepts of assimilation and accommodations? The religious paradigm in which many students are raised from birth say you absolutely cannot accept Jesus and evolution. So that's the very difficult groundwork that exists here. And it's not so much seated in assimilation versus accommodation. It's seated in coping strategies that I guess in some ways connect to that, but there's a third option. There's this concept of cognitive apartheid. And the cognitive apartheid concept is that you can have your cake and eat it too, you just don't put them together, right? So it's like I have this that exists here, it's bounded in these rules. I have this that exists here, it's bounded in these rules. I think the best example of this is Francis Collins. Highly spiritual, highly religious scientist, also very good scientist. And he has been quoted extensively as saying, you know, I really wish that what I learned in the sciences and what I'm seeing in science and what I've witnessed and studied aligned to my beliefs, but my beliefs say this, my science says this, I keep my beliefs in this box, my science stays in this box. And we just exist, right? So he elects to follow the science when it comes to evolution is taking place, but then he also exists in this place of faith. And so I think that's what's often missing is the idea that we have a forced dichotomy in so many places and things are just never going to be that black and white. And so it is very much about, you know, are these people and each student going to be, like you said, assimilate? Do they assimilate? Do they separate? Or can they exist in the middle? And what we're trying to do is create space in the middle for people to navigate into. And it's really something they have to navigate on their own. So it's just setting up those coping tools that they can adopt to even have the conversation in the first place, instead of just saying, oh, she said evolution, I'm out.
Yeah, thanks for addressing that, Amanda. What a complex amalgamation of ideas and feelings that we have to help our students navigate. This is a complex thing. We sure appreciate you sharing this broad spectrum of work that you've been engaged in. I think I can speak for everyone who has attended today. A great amount of thanks for all of the presenters today. A really diverse array of topics and ideas. So maybe just one more virtual round of applause for all of our presenters. Thank you so much for your participation here today. I just want to point out one thing before I turn some time over to Sue Ann. If you go to the chat, a couple of items there, you can see a link to the proceedings for everyone's work that they have put together for this symposium. The other thing you can see there is the link if you would like to be a reviewer for next year's research symposium. And it looks like a number of you have already taken the opportunity to engage in that. So we would encourage you to sign up. We need your help. Sue Ann, closing comments?
That's it. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to our wonderful presenters, all of you that have reviewed for us this year and in previous years, and all of your enthusiasm for this symposium attendees. And thank you. Have a great rest of the conference. There is an inclusion symposium, since so many of you have gotten galvanized by some of the topics we talked about today. Next Thursday, it is, gosh, I meant to look that up before. It is at 1 p.m. No, sorry, 4 p.m. Eastern time, 4 p.m. Baltimore time next Thursday. And so we encourage you to check that out as well.
Great. Thank you, everybody. Enjoy the conference.